Everyone, welcome to the Talent Insights podcast, brought to you by Careerwell and Careerwell. I'm your host, James Hornick. Today is the first of a new series we're calling Adventures in Job Seeking. Just kind of made that name up off the cuff. I thought it sounded cool at the time, which is focused on really telling the stories of real-life job seekers who made pivots or other career changes where we talk about what made their transition successful. So people who might have had kind of trickier job searches and how they kind of went above and beyond in landing that job. My guest today is someone who made such a pivot, recently landed a role as an HR Generalist at One World Sync. Everyone, please welcome Shandee Ewert.
Hello, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's actually, we also rebranded the entire podcast, which I didn't mention kind of so far. So for the longest time we were calling ourselves the Recruiting Insights Podcast. Kind of realized that we talk about a lot of different things. So we've talked about hiring initiatives. We've talked about how to enhance your career. We've talked about ageism. We've talked about diversity inclusion, how to build a sales team, like lots of different stuff like that. We really don't talk about true recruiting very often. And, it kind of all encompasses. And I think that changing things to the Talent Insights podcast is a little more accurate for kind of the different areas we like to do. But I was really excited to kind of chat with you because what we've been doing in adding Careerwell, which is kind of our second brand, I think it's really important to not just hear what we have to say about job seeking, but hearing people who have actually done it and seeing that some of these things that are a little outside the norm. And when I say norm, people who just apply to jobs online and get frustrated, all the time. But, and some of the things that you and I talked about in our previous conversation. So, but let's kind of kick that off. Like, first off, gave you some preparation for this and kind of what will be coming. What was your elevator pitch? Like when you talk to people, when you're doing your job search, how did you describe yourself and introduce yourself to everyone here?
Yeah, so I talked about being really excited to be transitioning into human resources because I'm driven by supporting the success of a business's personnel. So I had 10 years of experience in higher education administration. And although I didn't work in an HR department, I got experience with a whole wealth of HR functions. So I did full cycle hiring and recruitment, training. I was doing a lot of coaching of leaders and managers, employee relations, but I also really enjoyed the admin aspects. And so all the things that I really enjoyed about the work that I was doing, I realized that is human resources. And so I wanted to move into a human resources position and move out into the corporate sphere and get some experience in a different challenge. So in addition to all of those HR skills that I brought with me, I also brought a lot of things that set me apart because of my higher education experience. So I've done a lot of project management and budgeting and event planning, a lot of equity and diversity work, and had experience supervising. I also had some international experience in my background, so that really enables me to communicate effectively across cultures and across identities. And so when I realized I wanted to make this switch, I kind of played the long game. I got an MBA with an emphasis in HR, so that enabled me to understand how HR fits into the financial picture of an organization. And so I really wanted to move into a company that I could contribute those skills in a fast-paced and innovative and a growth-oriented environment. So that was kind of the summary of what I was looking for. And that's what I had the opportunity to relay a lot in informational interviews, and then expand on my story from there.
Okay. And tell us, I guess, get us up to speed now, like your job now at One World Sync, like how'd you come across that? What's your role there? Like, just tell us a little about the organization to provide a little more context still.
Yeah, so the organization does product content management. So we operate in the technology space, so it's kind of technology and sales is the focus of the organization. And honestly, I didn't know a whole lot about product content management before I found out about the company, but the more I read, the more impressed that I was. And how I ended up finding out about the position was that I had done an informational interview with somebody back in January or February. So I was connected actually through my alma mater. I had contacted the career service office of my alma mater. It was a part of a lot of different networking that I did. So that was just one of many, many contacts. And they connected me to this individual who was also an alum and worked in HR. And so we had a conversation. And so that individual later ended up getting a a position at One World Sync and said, hey, there's actually this opening for an HR generalist, maybe you would be interested. And so I had maintained contact. And so I think she remembered me when that position was open, said, hey, this might be a good fit for your skills. And so I applied, and I think having somebody within the company to whom I had already told my story and kind of knew the skills that I had to offer, as opposed to just reading it on a resume or reading it on a cover letter, that enabled me to get the opportunity for a phone screen. And I found that once I got on the phone with somebody, once I had the opportunity to interview, I was able to articulate my experience really well and in a way that resonated with employers or with people I was networking with. But it was just, my experience wasn't coming across the way I needed it to, just in a cover letter or a resume, as well crafted as they might have been.
Okay.
So I'm really excited about the opportunity. It's actually ended up to be a really perfect fit because I'm getting experience in a lot of different areas of HR, and that's really what I was looking for. So I'm touching pretty much every area in doing the day-to-day, but also long-term planning and projects. And the company is at a growth phase, and it's full of people who are really energetic and they're visionary. And so I'm really excited to be there, and I'm also really excited to be doing recruiting and talent acquisition as part of my position. That's something that I'm really passionate about. So the positions that we're hiring for right now, I get to be involved in all of that. So it's really a great fit.
Okay. So how long was your job search in total? Like, when did you, I think you started end of last year, or?
Yeah, almost 6 months. Yeah, I had finished a contract position for a higher education company at the very end of December. So, and I started my current position, it'll be a month on Friday. So almost 6 months.
Okay. What was your initial struggle, right? So I just want to make sure we can kind of lay the groundwork for what were you doing at first, the first month or two in your search, that wasn't really that effective, where you realized you need to kind of change things up and try some different methods?
Yeah. Well, honestly, James, I think I was a little naive going into the job search at first. I knew how to get a job in higher education. I've been doing it for 10 years. I knew the job boards to look at. I knew how to make the contacts. I knew the language, so I was trying to apply what I had done there to a completely different sphere. So I had started by looking at job boards. I had made a list of companies that I was interested in just by looking at, lists of, top companies for diversity, top companies to work, all of those types of lists that you can find out there. And it was a very, very long list. I think I had about 150 companies on it. And I would regularly check these companies' job boards. I was also looking on LinkedIn and Glassdoor and Indeed. And every time I would see a position with a title that interested me, and I was looking in recruiting, human resources, and I have some experience in training. So I was looking at learning and development positions as well. And every time I would see one, I would open it up immediately, and then I would read about the company, and then I would decide whether or not the company was interesting, and then I would put in an application. And it just got to the point where it didn't feel organized. It felt overwhelming. There was just too many things to watch. And also, I wasn't getting responses. As much as I was catering my resumes and cover letters to those positions, I found that employers just weren't understanding my background. They didn't understand my previous position titles coming from a different industry. And I understand it, right? Why would you hire somebody from a different industry when you could hire somebody who's done the exact same position that you're looking for at a different company? So when I was applying for higher level positions, or kind of like the position I had now, I found that people were looking at my resume and saying, well, you don't have experience in our computer systems, or you don't have specific experience in this function of the job, even if I had the transferable skills. And if I was applying for lower level positions, say very entry level or administrative assistant, those type, just to get into a company, they would look at my resume and say, well, you run all these processes. Why would you just want to be an administrative assistant? You'll be bored, you'll leave. So what I really needed to do was to get in front of people to tell my story. And so I figured out that wasn't working. So I started doing better networking. And through those informational interviews that I was doing, one of the things that was recommended to me was a book called The 2-Hour Job Search. And so that's kind of the method I use. It's not going to work for everybody. It happened to work for me. So I adapted a lot of the things in that book in terms of how to make a target employer list. So I narrowed down my list of companies from 150 to something that was actually manageable. How to follow up on informational interviews, because even the informational interviews I was doing at the very beginning, I wasn't doing a good job of following up because I think I didn't know how. I felt like I was bothering people. I felt like I don't know what I have to offer to them. I don't want to seem like a burden. And so I took a lot of the tips about how to follow up and how often to follow up, and what information you can offer informational interviewers, whether it be sharing an article or offering information on something you have some expertise in. Those things helped me to feel like it was more of a genuine relationship, because these individuals were so incredibly generous with their time and with their knowledge. And they're people that I hope to stay in contact with for a very long time. And I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a one-way relationship.
And let's talk a little bit more about like just defining informational interviews, because I think a lot of people are probably not familiar with that term and or that kind of process. Because we always talk about in terms of networking with people and building relationships and whatnot. So when you're talking about informational interviews, you don't mean like a interview with a company, like a formal one. You're more just like interviewing with people that you're trying to network with to learn more about their company, learn more about what skill sets they might see are valuable to you, or how would you, I guess, define it when you were setting these up? Who were you targeting and who were you trying to set these conversations with?
Yeah. So I mean, in my job search, I was also looking to build my network in recruiting and HR, because I didn't have a good one. And honestly, that was one of the mistakes that I made when I was planning this job transition. You know, I thought a lot about the experience that I was getting. I thought about how I could enhance my educational background, but I didn't think about building my network. So honestly, I started building my HR and recruiting network to a greater degree in January when I started the job search. Mm-hmm. If I could go back, I would do that differently, but here we are. So the conversations that I was having with people were really learning about what they did. It was, I was asking questions about their background, about projects they were currently working on, about ways that they were involved in the industry. So if they were involved in professional organizations, what professional organizations have they found useful? What resources have they tapped into either on a regular basis now or when they were entering the industry that they might recommend? What's their company culture like from the inside? When they do job searches, what questions do they ask? What types of companies do they look for? I talked to several people who had made major transitions in their careers in terms of the areas they were focusing on. So they were able to share with me, you know, I found out I didn't like this and here's why. And that may or may not have been something that I would have enjoyed, but it was helpful to hear it from the perspective of somebody who had actually done it. So these were all just conversations I had to learn about people, learn about their backgrounds, learn about their companies, and then staying in contact, because sometimes those individuals might have known about a position opening at another company that might fit my skills. Maybe a position would come open at their company in the future and they might be able to refer me. And sometimes just that referral can actually help get your application looked at and get you to the phone interviews. And that's all I needed, was to get into an initial phone screening so I could articulate my experience better than it was showing up on paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's several things to unpack there. Like one, you mentioned before, it's easier to do that than it is like to show it on paper. And that's, I think that if you're looking for a job, one of the takeaways from this is that you just need to think of any way you can get around just the paper step, you know, and just setting up conversations and actually talking with people, because even if your background is a dead-on fit for something, anytime you can build a relationship and anytime you can get someone to put in a word for you or get to know you as a person, it just makes it that much easier to get past that first step. One thing I want to mention too is that you talked about ways to follow up and ways to provide value without being, you know, and follow up without being annoying, and ways to provide value so it becomes a relationship. That's the thing. I hear that a lot. The following up without being annoying is like the one thing that I think that makes most people uncomfortable, you know, finding ways to do that. So do you have any tips for that? Like how did you go about the follow-up process? How did you go about just like adding value as opposed to just, you know, asking questions and making it one-sided?
Right. So I got better at it as time went on. But anytime somebody offered me advice, whether it be look into this resource, read this article, read this book, listen to this podcast, whatever it was, I did it. Okay. Because they were taking their time to share this advice for me. They were giving it for a reason. So I followed up. I did those things. And then I followed up and I let them know how it worked out. Maybe it was another informational interview they connected me to. And so I made sure to follow up and said, hey, I had this conversation with so-and-so. They were really helpful in this area. Thank you. So one, it was following up on advice. So that was a reason to reach back out, because people want to know that, you know, they took the time to provide this to you. it's kind and professional to show them that you did it. But also some of the pieces of conversations that popped up that I might have some expertise in. So there were some folks that I talked to who were looking at some diversity training things in their companies, and I was able to take some things that I had used in higher education and pass on those resources. I talked to one individual whose son was interested in study abroad opportunities. I know something about that, so I was able to offer some perspectives on that. Now, I'm not going to say that I was able to do this for everybody, and so obviously expressing that gratitude and making sure that when that in the future I maintain that relationship. So should I be able to offer something, whether it be help on a project or boosting one of their things on LinkedIn or commenting on their LinkedIn post, whatever it might be, that I'm doing that because I want to, and it's important to me to give back in the way that I can. So some of the people it was to a lesser degree, but some I was able to offer a little more, and hopefully with those ongoing relationships, it'll continue to build.
Okay. That's valuable. I'm going to take that away and steal that for later. So what's one thing I want to mention too, like what tools did you use? So like in terms of tracking, I know at first you said you were taking on too much, but so you kind of pared things down, but even still, like when you're doing as many informational interviews as you did, I don't know if you mentioned like if you track how many you've done, but there's some level of, in order to do all this follow up and take all this advice and show people you're taking their advice seriously, you have to be able to kind of, close that loop. From that standpoint, like how are you tracking your progress with everything?
Yeah, I did a lot of informational, actually between 60 and 70 informational interviews over the last 6 months. So it was a lot. And I wanted to make sure I was following up with all of them. So I just tracked all the information in Google Docs. So actually the book I mentioned actually had a system that they recommended. So I used a modified version of that system. I had a target company list, and then I had a list of informational interviews, when I had last communicated with people, what that communication was about, what platform I used to communicate with them. Maybe it was LinkedIn, maybe it was email. And then I would add to my calendar, just Google Calendar, reminders each day for when I should be following up with certain people, or when I should be following up on an application I submitted. Because without those reminders, I think I'm a pretty organized person, but I think even I would have lost track just trying to look at a giant spreadsheet and figure it out. So yeah, pretty simple free tools. Okay.
Any other takeaways from the experience? I mean, I know that you had mentioned kind of starting off that, and this is the one thing I think it's easy to say in the moment, because I think people, when you're looking for a job, you realize, man, I should do a better job of networking. But I think you had mentioned when you started this whole thing off, you realized that your network wasn't as big in this area as you wanted. So I'm assuming one of your takeaways is kind of always network and always kind of be more proactive even when you don't need to look. Have you thought more about that? And are there any other things like takeaways in terms of what you're going to change kind of going forward in your career, just to always have kind of a lot of this groundwork laid out for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, like you mentioned, the networking for sure. I think I have had this impression in the past that networking just feels slimy and it doesn't have to. And I think it's all in how you maintain those relationships afterwards too. So now that I'm employed, I'm in the process of following up with all of those 60 to 70 people, because I said, I'll keep you updated on how things are going. So I'm going to keep them updated. I'm going to stay in touch and closing that loop. So not just using them to get a job and then dropping those relationships. So the networking for sure. I think, I touched on the documents, cover letters and resumes, but I put a lot of focus on that too. I mean, I think I have about 30 different versions or updates of my resume and cover letter along the way. I hired a consultant to help me make sure that the language that I had previously been using in higher education was transitioning to the language that I needed to use to express what I had been doing in human resources language instead of higher education language. So that was really helpful. But also, a lot of people who are really generous, either as recruiters, and I want to touch on recruiters, I know we talked about them previously as well, or from informational interviews I did, people who are willing to look at my resume, who actually worked in the field of recruiting and human resources. So step one was working with that consultant to do that first transition, and step two was taking advice from people who were in the field. I think initially I had a hard time letting go of some of the things on my resume because I had worked so hard to achieve some of those things in higher ed over the past 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a while to get comfortable saying, this second page, it needs to go. And maybe I can use it as examples in interviews, but there was some ego attached to it. I thought
Yeah.
I worked so hard.
I see this all the time.
To just delete it is so hard,
Yeah.
But once I got to that point, I was much more comfortable with the documents I had, personalizing every single cover letter, every single resume for every job application that I did, using the language that they do. And that takes a really long time. I never applied via LinkedIn because I know those resumes often get overlooked. That quick apply is so tempting, but often they don't get responses. But working with recruiters, I know we touched on that. If we have a few minutes, I'd love to talk about
I was going to say, is there anything, because I know this is where things are going to take a turn. Because I did want to say in general, like I guess the question to load this up is, what things just didn't work? What did you learn in terms of what you wouldn't do next time, or what things do you think a lot of people rely on that really aren't that optimal compared to the success you saw?
Yeah. Some of the things we talked about earlier, like the scattershot approach with the cover letters, resumes, and the application, it didn't work. I think I also want to acknowledge my unique position here. So, I was looking for relatively entry-level roles. The methods that I use might not be as successful for executives. You might not be able to make a target company list and then just wait till an executive position comes open. That's not going to work. I also want to acknowledge the challenges of the current market. So yes, there are less jobs out there, but also the same challenges that have always been present are there still. So identity-based bias in the hiring process is a very real thing that a lot of candidates are up against. And I know I'm going on a little tangent here, but I will return.
No worries.
And so one of the things that James and I talked about when we talked about this conversation is that we're not denying that those things are at play, but I think the resources that James and Careerwell are trying to offer are to provide the candidates with the resources to be as successful as they can within their sphere of influence. So hopefully some of these things will be useful to some people. But recruiters are the other thing that I want to touch on. I think a lot of people, myself included, go into relationships with staffing agencies thinking they're going to help me get a job. And it's not recruiters' job to, at least staffing agency recruiters, to help you find a job. And I learned that relatively quickly as I started having conversations with staffing agencies. And that doesn't mean that they don't want to. I think I talked to a lot of folks at staffing agencies, including Hirewell, who I could tell were really invested in my success and were really willing to offer feedback about resumes, to do reality checks about the market or the positions I was looking at. And I found that incredibly valuable. Some people willing to connect me to other people for informational interviews. But what recruiters can't do, and I mean, James, you're the expert in this, companies are looking for specific things. And so I wouldn't, if I were in a recruiter position, if somebody's looking for an HR generalist who has HR generalist experience, I wouldn't have put my resume forth either. Like, you need to put forward the top candidates. And so I think people get disillusioned with recruiters because it might not immediately help them find a job, but I think it's because there's some misperceptions about what the recruiter's role actually is. But James, you can say more about that.
Yeah, so it's funny because Shandee and I were talking about this before the call, and she was like, I don't know if I should talk about this. I'm like, oh, absolutely talk about this. This is what I want to get into. And I guess I can talk about both internal and external recruiters, because it's very much a similar kind of issue. In that it's a recruiter's job to find people who fit an immediate role that a company has, whether they're internal or external. And I can also explain like why you had so much of a better result when you were taking more of a kind of networking based informational interview approach. A lot of people don't understand that recruiters, whether or not they're internal or external, they work for the company. That's their job. So recruiters, most people in the industry want to help people out, but that's more of like the positive externality. You know what I mean? You get to help people along the way, you get to build some relationships, but in terms of the immediate here and now, you're ultimately responsible to work with the company, and as you said, finding someone who's going to fit their immediate need. Part of the reason why we developed Careerwell is because we want to do more. So Careerwell's role versus Hirewell is to actually help people become better at job seeking so they can help themselves out. But if you take back, and I'll try to get my hands in view of the frame here, so this might make sense. If you look at how positions are made, and this can be true whether it's a new position or whether it's a position that is a replacement, it starts with a business need. Like there's an actual need for some skill set, or something that's lacking in an organization. And a lot of times it's the hiring managers at this phase in the process. They just have a list of ideas, a list of requirements, right? And they're not necessarily, it's never perfect. Sometimes they have requirements they realize later on that they don't need. Sometimes they miss things. It's kind of a messy process, and it always is going to be. And then they put that into a document. They make a list of requirements, and then they partner with their recruiters and say, okay, all right, guys, go, this is what I need. Go find it, that type of thing. And at that point in time, that's where it becomes a very tactical type of process. So as you mentioned, recruiters looking for, all right, these are the 3 things they mentioned. I got to find someone who's got these 3 things, and I'll get back to them. They can only have time to talk to 5 people. You know what I mean? So it's my job to make their job easier by kind of nailing it. The issue is that, you're going to have 100, 200 people apply to those jobs, and they have to get kind of filtered down by those specific hard requirements. That's why, in situations where a job is already created, where the job description already exists, and talking to a recruiter, if you don't fit those requirements to the T, it's not going to be a very fruitful kind of process for you. But as I mentioned, kind of starting this whole thing out, if your hiring managers, when they're creating these job descriptions, most hiring managers, they just want someone who can do the job. They just want someone who they can show up, get the job done. But they don't know anybody, right? So they have to make these requirements and find somebody. But to your point, and what made you successful in the search, they knew you, right? If you can network with people, and they actually, when they have all these different requirements in their head, and they're trying to figure out, okay, what's this position look for? They're going to say, you know what, this looks like something. This is something Shandee could do. This looks like someone I already know could actually do this job, and that's why. So I guess I'm kind of giving this long-winded explanation. That's why it's important for job seekers, especially ones who there's some skill sets that it's going to be really easy for them to find a job. If you're a coder and you're good, none of this really matters. You're going to be okay.
You probably don't need our help.
Yeah. But for most of the population, people will have some kind of struggles with job seeking. And it's a lot of times because people are too reliant on waiting till jobs requirements are already written and applying to those jobs, as opposed to getting to know people who might need their skill set and building relationships ahead of time. That way they're already in the back of that hiring manager's head when those needs come up. That's ultimately why you're successful in this search, and why you started seeing more success and traction as your process went along. But that's also why, as you kind of mentioned it too, so there are certain people with certain skill sets that recruiters are gonna be able to help more than others. Most recruiters do want to help. And that's why, Careerwell, we're creating Careerwell, so we can actually help people become better job seekers. But it's more of just a point of reference for, I think a lot of people just misunderstand how the industry and the process is structured. But once you kind of understand it, it just makes more sense and can enable you to be better at your own job search. So.
Absolutely. And even if whether or not I was ever sent a position by a particular recruiter, like I said, those relationships I found to be incredibly valuable. They had insight into the industry that I did not have, and that I wasn't even hearing from people who were in the industry, because they're not experts in job searching. They have their one job, or maybe had worked at a couple different companies. And so I'm really grateful to Careerwell for the resources and the advice and the guidance that was provided to me throughout that process. And so, and like you said, the traction that I made, the interviews that I ended up having, I ended up interviewing over the course, some processes were stalled due to COVID, but 5 companies over the course of my job search. Every single one I got because I happened to know somebody who was able to refer me, whether it was somebody outside the company who referred me to inside the company, or somebody from within the company. I did not get any interviews from cold applications. So that's just my experience, and people with different skill sets in different industries might have a different one. So.
This has been a great conversation. I want to know if there's any other advice. We talked about a lot of stuff. Anything else you wanted to mention? Anything you forgot? Any other last minute piece of advice for job seekers that might be going through a similar type of pivot in search?
I don't think so. I think we pretty well covered it. But I think through your, if that networking is engaged in, I think you'll get a lot of great advice that that you or I, James, can't possibly even know about necessarily if it's for a particular industry. And I certainly did as well. All of those conversations, I learned a ton, whether it was about a particular company, how to better approach job searching, insight into particular positions. And so I think those relationships will give you the advice that you might be looking for.
Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap it up for this episode. Thanks again for everyone to listening to the Talent Insights podcast. If you like what you heard and want more insights from the team, visit hirewell.com/recruiting-insights. Note to self, I need to change the URL of the podcast page to Talent Insights. And remember to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Shandee, congratulations again. And thanks again for joining the podcast. Everyone else, we will see you soon.